So our new unit today that we're starting is going to be about the Renaissance. It took place between 1485 and 1625. So the Renaissance officially began in Italy and not in England, and it actually began with the visual arts. So mediums of art that involve painting or sculpting, things that you look at visually. And this started primarily with Pope Julian II when he commissioned the painting for the Sistine Chapel. And you'll see the picture on the right there of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, which is most notably known for this time period. Some notable people that you guys might be familiar with from other history classes that were also notable in this time period were Leonardo da Vinci. So if you've ever seen the Mona Lisa or the painting of the Last Supper, those are things he's most known for. Also, they came out with the movie, The Da Vinci Code, so those kinds of things. You also have Michelangelo, who's also notable during this time period as well as an artist. Christopher Columbus also came and discovered what he thought were the Indies, which is where we get the Indians, through Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the king and queen. And then you also had Galileo doing a lot of astrological things. One of the big movements that we're going to focus on when talking about the Renaissance time period is the movement we call humanism. And it's a social movement that believed that virtue is the highest possession, the highest thing that you can achieve. And that virtue is the only source of true happiness in life, that nothing else in life is going to make you happy unless you reach this source of virtue. And it basically was their attempt, the people during this time, their attempt to harmonize the Bible and the classic literature. And what we mean by classic is those things like myths, Greek myths, Roman myths, those things talking about Zeus and Hera and Hercules, Poseidon, those kind of things. And they're going to try and blend those and make those work with stories from the Bible during this time period. There are also several new technological movements that are going on. And one of the major inventions that really helped progress what was going on during this time, especially in literature, was the invention of the printing press. And that was by Johann Gutenberg in Mainz, Germany in 1455. And of course, with that invention comes the ability to mass produce literature, which is a big deal for people who weren't able to obtain that before because you only had one copy of a book, or because you had monks sitting down and writing them all by hand. This way we can mass produce one copy that was written down several hundreds of times and put it in the hands of several other people, making books now more affordable to lower class. Another movement during this time wasn't exactly what we call a social movement. It was more religious. It focused on the religious aspect of people's lives. Remember, during this time period, there is no separation between church and state. So the Catholic Church is what reigns supreme, right? But people start to wise up during this time period. They start to reject the authority of the Pope, okay? They also start turning towards nationalism, which is pride in one's country. Okay, so we talk about that a lot when we have USA and we wear the American flag and those kinds of things. There were also a lot of financial burdens imposed by the Roman Church, the Catholic Church. If the church ran into financial burdens, then they would impose those fees and those taxes then on the people of several different countries that they oversaw. So a lot of people are not okay with this. You have a lot of foreign influence coming from Italy, not necessarily England, okay, but from Italy because that's where the church was located. One German monk that particularly saw a lot of issues with the Catholic Church was Martin Luther. You guys definitely have studied him in your history classes. He's the one that nailed his 95 Theses to the wall, or to the door, sorry, of the church. And he believed in this new form of Christianity in which you can gain a personal understanding over the word of the Pope, that you yourself can study God's word and you don't need a bishop up there reciting something in Latin and you're supposed to buy it at face value. He believed that you yourself could gain that personal understanding with a one-on-one relationship with God. Another person to note during this time period is John Wycliffe. He was known as the English morning star of the Reformation, and it's because he actually ended up coming up with the first English translation of the Bible. Because remember, before this, it's all being read aloud in Latin or Hebrew from those bishops in the church. Okay, he actually condemned sacramental teachings and believed that men of the cloth should live in poverty. He believed if you're going to talk the talk, you need to walk the walk as well. So if you're going to tell people that they need to tithe and they need to do this and they need to do that, then you yourself as a teacher should do that as well. That's what he means by men of the cloth. Someone we also just want to touch base on for a minute here is the French theologian and reformer John Calvin. So he ends up coming up with Calvinism, and some of you guys probably have heard of him as well. But he was actually forced to move to Switzerland for fear of his life where he actually began his church. John Knox is another person that had a lot of religious influence. He was a Scottish reformer, and he believed that education, primary education at least, should be provided in all the parishes, so throughout all the land in that particular county or country, sorry. And he believed that money should be given to help the poor and that the church should not have luxury. Because before this time, the Catholic Church had a lot of gold inlaid into their furniture and their building and their cathedrals, and it was just very elaborate and ornate. And at this point, why is all the money going to the church when it should really be going to help the poor? Instead of providing the church with these luxurious buildings that everyone's just going to sit and stare at, it's better that that money go to help the poor. So he actually ended up beginning a Presbyterian church. One of the biggest things that happened during this time period is the movement through the monarchy and all of the drama that came with it. One of the best things about this time period is the drama that goes on. It's basically like a big soap opera on TV. This has been studied in so many of your classes, and you probably remember this from several of your history classes over the course of several years. But during the Renaissance, the monarchy started with Henry Tudor. This is after the War of the Roses. We know him as Henry VII. So he's the first in the Tudor line, and he, of course, won the War of the Roses against the House of York. And he does that by marrying Elizabeth, that was a York lady. They ended up having 4 children together, Arthur, Margaret, Henry, and Mary. And Arthur, their heir, ends up marrying Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen of Spain, those ones that commissioned Columbus's sail and exploration. But Arthur ends up actually dying a few months later after they were married, and Henry then becomes the new heir. Henry ends up taking his widowed wife as his own wife and marries Catherine so that they could keep that political allegiance that they had with Spain. So Henry does inevitably become the new king of England and then therefore becomes Henry VIII of England after his father. He's also known as a Renaissance man because he believed in the sense of rebirth among his people. He played several instruments and he was a ladies' man, and that's really evident because he had 6 wives, and we'll get into each of those here in just a minute. But he does have 2 other great accomplishments that he does throughout his life. He does create the Royal Navy, and he also separates from the Catholic Church and creates his own Church of England. And we'll talk about how that comes about because of his relationships with his wives. So his very first wife, of course, is the widow of his brother, Arthur, right? He marries her, and they stay married for 24 years. They had a daughter together. They had Mary, who inevitably is going to become Bloody Mary, and we'll talk about her a little bit later. But he ends up creating a Church of England so that he can get divorced from her, because the Pope won't let him divorce her, because he ends up falling in love with this lady named Anne Boleyn, who's on the right. Because the Pope won't recognize their divorce and won't grant it to him, he decides, well, I don't need the Pope, so I'm going to do my own thing and create my own church and be the head of that church myself. So when Pope Clement refused him, of course, he grants his own divorce himself by starting this new church. So then he decides to marry Anne Boleyn, who he's had as a mistress. She actually served under Catherine in her royal court, so the one that got her ready for events and stuff and helped her get dressed. So they were really close and knew each other well. So it's kind of an awkward situation between the ladies. They do end up having a child together, a daughter, Elizabeth. But she refuses to divorce Henry because, of course, somebody else catches his eye because he's just that much of a ladies' man. But he wants the divorce, and she won't grant it. So he ends up coming up with a way to get rid of her by beheading her and accusing her of adultery, which there's been some speculation is true or not, because they accuse her of trying to commit adultery with her brother. So not only adultery, but also incest, because she can't bear a male heir. But Elizabeth is thrown out because her mom is beheaded, and she's seen as a traitor to the crown because of this falsely accused adultery. So Jane Seymour is the 3rd wife after, of course, Anne Boleyn is beheaded, and the one he was seeing, and the reason he wanted the divorce from Anne Boleyn. She actually served as maid of honor to both of the prior queens, Anne Boleyn and Catherine of Aragon, so it makes it kind of awkward there. But she is the only one who gave him a son named Edward. However, after 12 days after giving birth to Edward, she does die due to some complications because, of course, the medical field isn't what it is today back then. Henry does decide to wait for 2 years before he decides to marry again. It's said that Jane was his favorite. And most people speculate that's because she didn't last long enough to tick him off or long enough for him to get bored with her, and the fact that she is the only one who gave him a male son and a male heir to the throne. Then he decides to marry for political advantage. So he marries Anne of Cleves, who's the sister of the Duke William of Germany. She's willing to cooperate with him, and she receives land and money because of that. And they remain good friends, but they ended up hating each other. He only married her because her portrait looked nice, but never met her in person. And once he did, kind of regretted the decision because she didn't exactly look the way she was perceived in her portrait. So they actually divorced each other as well. Henry then becomes very smitten with this girl, Catherine Howard, who some of his advisors put kind of under his nose so that they notice her, so that they can gain some political advantage as well in their system. And she, of course, is the first cousin of Anne Boleyn. They called her the unspoiled rose without a thorn, but it was very evident that she was definitely a spoiled rose. She tended to sleep around with several male consorts before even meeting the king. She was caught cheating with her music teacher, so she did commit adultery, and of course she was beheaded for it. He then later married Catherine Parr, and she kind of did it reluctantly. It was her third husband. She was nursing the king while he was sick from an injury he received while out hunting, I believe. And she ended actually surviving Henry. And she ended up remarrying her true love, Thomas Seymour, but died the next year of childbirth complications. So she still ends up dying, even though she outlives Henry. Of course, the only male heir that Henry has is Edward, and he ends up following his father to the throne. Of course, he is the son, again, of Jane Seymour, and he becomes king at the age of 9 because he is that young when Henry dies. However, because he is such a young age, they grant the power to his relatives, and so the Duke of Northumberland is the guy who ends up becoming regent or king regent, so ruling in the place of a young ruler. But Edward ends up dying at the age of 15 because he contracts TB. Then, of course, the Duke of Northumberland doesn't want to lose any kind of power over anyone, so he decides to put his daughter-in-law on the throne instead. She's only queen for 9 days, and her husband, of course, are executed by Bloody Mary, and that is the true legitimate child of Henry VIII and Catherine Aragon. So here we have a picture of Bloody Mary, or Mary the First, and again, she's the daughter of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII. She was a devout Catholic because, remember, during the whole debacle, right, the fact that her father split from the Church of England is what brought about her sort of downfall because of her mother and what granted the divorce. The Pope wouldn't technically stand for it. So she, of course, was a devout Catholic and restored the Pope's power in England. Because of that, she burned 300 Protestants at the stake. So that's people that were in the Church of England that Henry VIII created. She did end up marrying Philip II of Spain, but she ended up dying of a fever. She's kind of up there in age, so it wasn't that young. But her half-sister Elizabeth I is going to end up succeeding her to the throne. So Queen Elizabeth I is the big Queen Elizabeth that you always hear about. She, of course, is the daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, so there was a big rivalry between her and Mary I. She was known as a virgin queen, but that wasn't necessarily because she herself was a virgin. It was just she didn't want to marry and have a man rule over her because we had that patriarchal society where men are always in charge. And she felt if she married a man, then the man would become king and she would no longer have any say-so and no one would care about what she thought was best for her people since she was the rightful Queen of England. So she does end up reestablishing the Church of England and again kicks the Pope to the curb. She survived several plots to kill her by Mary Queen of Scots and ends up destroying the Spanish Armada with the Royal Navy that her father created. She inspired several literature, so that's when we get into Shakespeare. Shakespeare was commissioned by her to write several plays, and she does end up ruling for 45 years, which is a really big deal for a monarch back in those days. So James I, and he's actually James VI of Scotland, is the son of Mary Queen of Scots, and of course, because Elizabeth never married, she didn't have an heir. So she named her cousin, which was Mary Queen of Scots, her son to be her heir to the throne. He's the first one to rule both countries, Scotland and England, and he actually ends up sponsoring the new translation of the Bible, which is the King James Version. So he's the guy that's responsible for that one. He also is the King James in the Pocahontas movie because he's the one that establishes Jamestown in 1607. But however, England is always in a constant state of turmoil under his reign. He wasn't an efficient king. After James, of course, there was Charles I. However, the country was in a state of civil war throughout his reign. So there was a 135-person tribunal that's to decide his fate on whether or not they would let him remain king or if they would just execute him. And during that vote, it was 68 to 67. So one person tipped the vote and he was beheaded. The next person to rule wasn't a monarch by birth or anything. He was kind of elected. His name was Oliver Cromwell. He ended up ruling England for 11 years, but throughout that entire time period, there was still civil war going on and a lot of foreign success. So Parliament ended up kind of opposing him, and so they decided to throw him out and reinstate the rightful heir. This heir, of course, is going to be Charles II, and he had a different change in values. He valued science over religion, and they ended up developing a two-party system, the Whig and Tory parties, which you guys should really be ringing bells in your heads. And he's the guy that kind of brings the Renaissance to an end.